All right. So I mentioned in the sermon last week that we were talking about money and giving, and I talked about the tithe briefly, and I said we are going to dive in much more deeply on the topic in this class. So that's what we're going to do. How many folks grew up in a church or in a tradition where you heard about tithe? That was something you heard. Okay.
We heard about it.
Yeah.
It was pretentious for Catholics.
Okay. Yeah.
You got your envelopes. So
That's right.
Make sure you get your envelopes.
Okay. And did was it explicit like it's 10% of your income? Was that kind of explained? Okay. All right. Yeah. I grew up in a church a lot like mine, a Christian church, where we would say, now it's time to collect our tithes and offerings. Nobody ever told me what a tithe was, though. Like, I just thought it was sort of a synonym for offering.
I think I was an adult before I found out what it really meant.
Yeah. So some people grew up in traditions that like really explicitly talked about it. Others not so much. But it does just mean 10%. Tithe just means 10%. That's what the word means. So we're going to explore a little bit where that concept comes from, and then we're gonna take a look on see what do we think that means for us, thousands of years and many hundreds and thousands of miles removed from where the concept originally comes from. So tithing is first mentioned in stories in Genesis. Abraham gives a tithe, 10% to Melchizedek in Genesis 14, and Jacob gives a tithe, promises a tithe in Genesis 28. But then it gets commanded in the Torah starting in Leviticus. So you've got there that first reading from Leviticus 27. Does anyone want to read that one out loud?
All the tithes from the land, whether the seed from the ground or the fruit from the tree, are the Lord's. They are holy to the Lord. If persons wish to redeem any of their tithes, they must add 1/5 to them. All tithes of herd and flock, every tenth one passes under the shepherd's staff, shall be holy to the Lord. Let no one inquire whether it is good or bad, or make substitution for it. If one makes substitution for it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy and cannot be redeemed.
Okay. What the heck is going on? All right, that's at the very end of Leviticus. These are like close to the last few verses of Leviticus. Leviticus contains rules and laws and regulations around worship, around how the temple or the tent of meeting at the time is to be conducted. And it includes a section where it talks about ways you can make special vows to God. And what's going on here is it's telling you some things that can't be specially vowed to God. And one of those things is the tithe. That already belongs to God, is the sort of the thrust of this passage. And so seed, fruit, so grain, fruit, herd and flock, 1/10 belongs to God. It doesn't tell us here in Leviticus what happens to it. We might assume it's sacrificed or something like that. But 1/10 of seed, grain, fruit, olives, flocks comes from God. You can't switch it out because you count 10 sheep and you land on your best sheep. That's what it's saying. Okay, you can't, no switches, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, that's my best sheep. Let me just kind of switch them around here. Okay, so that's the thing about the place. If you wish to redeem any of the tithes, that means you want to buy it back. So you can instead of giving your best olives, you can give money, but there's a surcharge. You get a little extra. Okay. All right. Here's what I want us to notice. There are some assumptions about what's going on, right? First things first. Where in Leviticus, where are the people? Where are they? They're in the wilderness. They've like left Mount Sinai. The tent of meeting is going with them. They don't have any flocks or fruit or land, right? So this is talking about once they're in the land that's being promised, how they're going to treat and be responsible for the land that's been promised me. Notice the agricultural assumption. Yeah, it's grain, it's olive trees, it's flocks. No mention of like a day laborer or something like that, right? The assumption here is like there are people, they have land, the produce from that land, a tenth of it belongs to God. It's a tithe on the land, it's a tax on the land, because the sort of underlying assumption, right? The land is God's, right? The land was given to them by God, and they're supposed to recognize that by giving something back. Okay, so it's very much tied to the land. All right. That's all we get in Leviticus. Numbers gives us a little more detail. We're going to jump to Numbers 18. What has happened prior to this is there's been a rebellion against Aaron and Moses and the sort of the leadership. And God is now doing two things, talking to the people. One is shoring up Aaron's leadership a little bit. And the other saying, hey, y'all have kind of messed up here. Now, not everybody is going to get to go into the tent of the meeting. There's going to be a special group. One of the tribes is going to be responsible for the tent of the meeting because you all messed up. And the people are like, what, are we going to die? What's going to happen here? God says, well, I'm going to put a special class of people responsible for the place where my presence is. So who wants to read the Numbers 18?
To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for a possession in return for the service that they perform, the service in the tent of meeting. From now on, the Israelites shall no longer approach the tent of meeting, or else they will incur guilt and die. But the Levites shall perform the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear responsibility for their own offenses. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generation. But among the Israelites they shall have no allotment, because I have given to the Levites as their portion the tithe of the Israelites, which they set apart as an offering to the Lord. Therefore I have said of them that they shall have no allotment among the Israelites.
Okay, so the Levites are going to be responsible for the tent of the meeting. They are not going to get any land. The Levites aren't going to own any land. Remember this. This is going to come back. Okay? Levites don't own land. How are you going to live? Well, the tithe is going to feed the Levites, right? And then in the next section of Numbers, if we were to skim through it, we'd say they get 10%. They're supposed to then tithe a little bit of that from they tithe 10% from the 10% they've been given. That is sacrificed or given to Aaron, and they get to eat the rest. All right, so this is how the Levites are going to be sustained. The Levites are going to be responsible for kind of the upkeep of course, the tent of meeting, eventually the temple. They're going to be sort of administrators and responsible for the conducting of worship. They're not the priests. They're kind of like the deacons in our church, right? They're folks who are there to sort of support the flow of worship. And they are going to be sustained by this tithe in exchange for the fact that they're not going to hold any land. So they don't have a way of sustaining themselves, right? Okay. Notice still, agricultural assumption, right? The tithe is food. It's flocks, it's grain, it's wine, right? It's things that the Levites can eat, is the idea. Okay. All right, now we're going to go to Deuteronomy. Who wants to read from Deuteronomy 14?
Set apart a tithe, all yield of your seed that is brought in yearly from the field. In the presence of the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose as a dwelling for his name, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, your wine, and your oil, as well as the firstlings of your herd and flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. But if, when the Lord your God has blessed you, the distance is so great that you are unable to transport it, because the place where the Lord your God will choose to set his name is too far away from you, then you may turn it into money. With the money secure in hand, go to the place that the Lord your God will choose. Spend the money for whatever you wish, ox there in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your household rejoicing together. As for the Levites resident in your towns, do not neglect them, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you.
Okay, we'll pause there. We'll read the next part in a second. But notice this is something slightly different is being described now. Okay, there's a tithe, and you're going to take it to the place God will choose as a dwelling for God's name. What is that? It's tabernacle now. It's going to be the temple. Okay, great. Little problem. I've got a big flock, and I've got to get a tenth of it to the temple. That's a pain. So this says, it's cool. You can exchange it for money, and you can go to the temple with the money. That's easier to carry, and then you can buy the things you need for this festival. Who are you going to buy it from? You need somebody there at the temple who can say, exchange money for, right, like some sort of money changer, you might call it. All right, keep this in mind. Okay, we're creating a sort of an administrative structure here to involve for the exchange of things at the temple. Jesus is going to have some thoughts. Okay, this is describing this big harvest festival, right? You bring the tithe to first the tent of meeting, eventually to the temple, and you throw. There's a big party, right? You eat and you drink, and it's wonderful, right? It's this huge party. Is this the same thing, or is this different than the tithe for the Levites? It depends who you ask, right? There's different interpretations of whether this is additional details about the tithe that's just for sustaining the Levites, or whether this is kind of an additional tithe around a specific time of year or something. Some scholars would call this the second tithe, right? That's interesting, yeah. Or maybe it's the same tithe, and this is just details about how that tithe is carried out, right? It mentions making sure the Levites aren't neglected. So, okay, different people will read this and say, well, this is the second tithe. No, this is the same first tithe, but with some additional details. All right. Now,
Be the first tithe, because really you're talking about, I can't transport my big herd of sheep 500 miles.
right.
I'm going to sell them and bring some money.
Bring some money.
But I didn't realize that you bring money to the temple. I thought it was, you'll have a party, get what you need, and then be sure you cover the Levites as well.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to see that there's going to be kind of a centralization of how this happens. Okay, but
It also creates a way for the Levites to purchase things.
right.
They have money instead of animals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Real money.
Means they got money, right? And so they can purchase
Cash
and participate. Right. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. All right. So who wants to read then from 28 the rest of it? Okay.
Every third year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce for that year and store it in your towns. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows in your towns, may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God can bless you in all the work that you do.
So every third year there's a tithe that stays in the location, and all the folks who wouldn't have access to land are able to come and eat their fill. It's sort of like a food bank, right? But the Levites are included, but so are all of these other folks who might not have access to land or to resources.
So the whole idea for the tithe is to take care of the people who are less fortunate or are doing work for God.
Right.
The Levites are not the deacons.
Yeah. Who wouldn't have access to the resources of the land that God has given us. Okay. So there's Leviticus describes a general principle of tithing. 10% belongs to the Lord. Numbers lays out sort of specifics of what it's for, and then here in Deuteronomy we have more specifics that are maybe a different set of tithes, or maybe the same tithe being administered in a different way, right? Maybe these are different tithes taken at different times of the year. there's different ways this could be read. And so some have said, okay, there's 10% and it's kind of administered in these different ways. Others are saying the suggestion here is that like up to 30% of your produce is actually passed over, right? There's 10% for this on the third year, there's 10% for this harvest festival, there's 10% just for the Levites. So this third year one, it's called the year of the tithe in other places in the scripture. And in Judaism, there maintains a tradition of kind of the three tithes. One for the local, one for the big harvest festival, centralized, one for kind of those in.
I can see the ambiguity of the first part of this where you set apart a tithe. That's an indefinite article. That means there could be more. But on this last section, you shall bring the full tithe. That's definite. That means that's the only tithe.
That might be. Yeah.
That's why I read it.
Yep. Yeah. So, yeah.
The lawyer in me.
Sure. It is the law. All right, we are talking law, right? Yeah.
Which I'm not one.
And after studying the Talmud, all the laws associated with seed and
Yeah.
everything.
You want to have an interesting discussion, talk about the Torah.
It is like a lawyer trying to figure out
The
exactly.
definite and indefinite articles mean a lot to them. It
Yeah.
really does. Is it
Yeah.
A, which means there could be more, or is it B, meaning the only?
Yeah. And you see how, I mean, you all talked about the Talmud recently, right? How the oral tradition develops, right? Okay, what does this mean now? What does it mean once there isn't a temple, right? And big question, right? When first temple is destroyed, exile, how would you follow this law? What about when we're back and it's the second temple? Do we keep following that law? What about when that second temple is destroyed, right? It raises questions. Also, what about when we're not just an agricultural and nomadic society? Right? What about craftspeople? Do they have to tithe? The day laborers are supposed to be taken care of by the tithe. Interesting, right? I'm not answering the question, but it is a question that arises. What if I don't own land, right? Until recently, when I would talk about this, I'd say, I don't own land, I rent. Now I own land. Actually, a bank owns the land. They let me live there for a 6.85% interest rate, but let's just say I owned the land, right? What would it mean for me to tithe from my land? Well, I'm not an Israelite and I'm not in Israel. So that's an easy one. I could say, well, it doesn't apply. But okay, let's say it does apply to me as a landowner. Say I get about 10 eggs a week from the chickens, right? One of those eggs in the church, crack it on the altar. Right?
Got a question. Okay. Going back.
work with
When does the compensation with money really, when does that enter in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
And it must enter before Deuteronomy.
If you actually look at the language here where it talks about exchanging for money, the word there in Hebrew is almost always silver. So it would have been actual like silver.
Right. That's fine. But I mean,
right?
the idea of getting away from what was classically considered the barter system.
Yeah.
Okay. When does that really happen
Yeah.
in the Bible? I don't know.
I mean, around here, right? Because here we're talking about exchanging for money, right? So within the Torah, right?
Okay.
There's some sort of recognition of like, okay, I have all this grain. How am I going to get it there? Well, we need some sort of means of exchange, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know, like, what the first. I'd have to look up what the first mention of it is. But
Because you'd have to think that a craftsman, for example, would be compensated in part through the barter system,
yeah,
and possibly if he's got a large family or doesn't have enough work, compensated by the Levites.
yeah,
You would think.
maybe, right? But just notice, right? We have to perform some acts of interpretation to get there, right? So you jump ahead to 2025, and you say, like, what about day labor, right? What about a general contractor? Do they tithe? Right. What about a teacher or a social worker, right? We're steps removed from the thing that is being imagined when the tithe is being talked about in the Torah, right? So I just want us to notice that difference. That doesn't mean we can't make interpretive moves and say, okay, well, 10% seems to be kind of general. But we are talking about something a little different. Because actually, the closest thing we have, I'm going to make some of you shift in your seat a little bit, me too now. The closest thing we have to this in our modern day actually isn't giving to the church, it's property taxes. Right? And see, I have this much land, and I owe a certain amount of that land to
The community.
to the community, right? To a centralized authority who's going to administer it, supposedly.
Bring your garbage.
Right? Yeah.
Giving you water and
Right.
gas.
Funding the schools and okay, so like so properties, it's kind of like it's a tax on the land, right? It's a tithe on the land. Okay, so I just noticed the distance. All right, one more. Malachi. Who wants to read from Malachi 3?
I'll do it short. Will anyone rob God? Yet you're robbing me. But you say, how are we robbing you? In your tithes and offerings? You're cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house. Thus put me to the test, says the Lord. See if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down on you for you an overflowing blessing. I will rebuke the locust for you, so that it will not destroy the produce of your soil, and your vine and your field shall not be barren, says the Lord of hosts. Then all nations will count you happy, for you will be a land of delight, says the Lord.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So in Malachi, there is a plague of locusts. It is eating the land up. And God says, you didn't give the produce of your land. It's not your land to begin with, right? If you try to hoard it for yourself, the produce of the land goes away. If you're generous with the produce of your land, you'll have plenty. Don't remind anyone of a story. Can you think of a story in the Hebrew Bible where God says, look, if you try to hoard it, it's going to go away. Yeah. Right. So in the Exodus, right, people are hungry, and God says, there's going to be food. It's going to appear miraculously. They call it manhu, which means, what is it in Hebrew? What the heck is this? That's what manna means, okay? And
Mystery.
yeah, the mystery, this is like mystery honeycombs, right? And
Quick little side note, just completely off subject, but the lantern fly is thick in the mountains right now. We just travel through thick, and it destroys vineyards.
yeah,
It destroys the wine.
Yeah.
Just as you know.
So that's our modern day locust.
there you go. Yeah, it's just called the devourer in Hebrew. So it's anything that's up there. Right? Okay. So the prophet is saying, like, hey, this is what God told us, right? Like, if we give from the land is safe and secure. If not, well, we find out really quickly it wasn't our land to begin with, right? That's kind of the logic, right? And it's this callback to the story of the Exodus, right? Where the people will have enough, but if they try to hoard it, all of it's gonna rot. Okay, all right. So there you go. There's other passages we could look at in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, but that lays out sort of the structure of tithing, and then we see it show up again in the prophetic literature as the prophets kind of called it the people of God. So then what about this, right? Okay, there it is. It's in the Torah, it's in the Hebrew Bible. Does this apply for Christians? Well, I mentioned a couple of the tensions we have to kind of work through, right? We don't have the same agricultural assumptions necessarily. So does it apply to general contractors? Does it apply to teachers? There's also the tricky business that nowhere in the New Testament does it mention the early church following the tithe. Now, there are certainly parts in the New Testament where it talks about an offering. Paul writes about in his letters. But it doesn't mention the 10% rule. Paul does talk about setting aside from our income. So he does make the move to talk about income. And that's for the church and the poor in Jerusalem. That's what Paul is taking up the offering. We'll actually talk about that in worship in a few weeks. And then, of course, there's Acts. In Acts 2 and 4, we talked about last week, where people give everything, right? There's everything is held in common. People sell houses, sell land, and they give it all. Okay. So that's interesting, right? So what about Jesus? What does Jesus say? Well, when Jesus addresses the tithe, either implicitly or explicitly, it's almost always to criticize the practice, at least as he sees it playing out in the culture around. So Mark 11, we won't read word for word because it's a familiar passage. Jesus comes into Jerusalem and kicks all the money changers out of the temple, and he doesn't let anybody carry anything through the temple. Now, what's going on here? This is the Passover festival. So this is a slightly different festival than the harvest festival. But this whole structure of changing money in the temple and being able to buy animals, so this is what has been created by those passages in Deuteronomy, right? Jesus comes and he thinks this thing is corrupt, the way it's being played out in front of him. It disrupts the whole thing. And here in Mark, it's really explicit. It gets him, right? This is like, after he does that, all the leaders get together and they're like, we got your hands. Right? So this story gets told in all four Gospels, where Jesus comes in and he completely disrupts this system of exchange, right? That this is the Passover festival, but this also would have been what operated to make that tithing system. Okay. In Matthew 23, Jesus explicitly mentions the tithe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, good start. You tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Have any of you worked with mint or dill? Yeah, okay, so imagine the image that Jesus is presenting here is a Pharisee with like their pruning scissors, right? What's about a tenth of this, right? These tiny, tiny amounts, right? We're gonna get to exactly 10% because that's what's required. And he says you're doing this, and you're actually missing like the deeper point of justice and mercy, right? Of being God's faithfulness to us, the faithfulness that's called for, and what this is supposed to be for, right? Which is sort of making sure that God to heaven, right? And then he says, "These are really funny. Right? You blind guys, you strain out a gnat, you swallow a whole camel, right? Right. So it's really."
My wife used to work at Strawberry Street. Taxes came. They sent agents in, try to get taxes from the dishwashers and the people that had nothing.
Yeah.
They were only given tips by the service people. Tried to tax them.
Yeah.
And there's billionaires that pay no taxes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
This is kind of.
Right. The little things, right? And now notice though, what the Pharisees are doing here is they're trying to make one of the interpretive leaps that we were just trying to make, right? If we're not an agricultural society anymore, I don't have a land, I don't have field, what do I tie? My little like window, right? Right. So and Jesus is saying, oh, we're missing the point, right? We're missing the point by trying to take this sort of 10% law and kind of figure out how to apply it, right? I was thinking about my chickens, right? Got 4 chickens, so what's a tenth of 4 chickens?
Yeah, right.
Right, or like if I had a dozen eggs, I'd need to bring
A leg and a wing.
Yeah, right. I need to bring like an egg and then 2/5 of another egg, right? How do you get to 2/5 of an egg, right? So, and Jesus is saying, we're missing the point, right? We're missing the point. Okay, all right. The underlying wisdom of the Torah is being ignored in favor of trying to get like an exact way of matching up this ancient law with okay.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, one more. Luke 20. Somebody read this for me because I think this is kind of helpful. Okay.
In the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and who love respectful greetings in the marketplace and the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation.
Yeah, keep going. We're just this.
He looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly I tell you, the poor widow who has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all that she absolutely wants."
All right. This is about the temple tax, which is slightly different than the tithe, but kind of a similar logic. So this isn't explicitly about the tithe. It's about the temple tax, but kind of a similar logic, like what we have to give to maintain the worship. And we'll tell the story about the poor widow a lot. Right? She put in everything that she had, and that means more. But actually, that chapter division there, that's put in by later scribes. That's not in the original text. Why is the widow poor? Jesus just talked about it. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of it, right, he's talking about people who have like taken and taken and taken from the poorest. And then they're saying, "Oh, look, I'm so generous. Oh, I'm so generous." And meanwhile, the widow does everything she has to live on.
And the widows have nothing less.
Yeah,
A family has.
And nothing because of the results.
because of the results of this injustice. Jesus isn't saying the widow gave everything she had. Great, right? Jesus is saying the point of this system is supposed to be that the widow has things to live on, right? Not that I get to get my name on the temple windows, right? That's the kind of the thrust of this, right? So again, this is the temple tax, not exactly about tithing, but like
Given
Jesus is
from generosity of heart.
right from generosity of heart and making sure that right there's sort of like my extravagant giving isn't kind of ignoring like a need right in front of me, right? So
In
this is
CWF, we have a widow's mite or least coin offering
right.
that we take up every month.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're talking about this puts another level of understanding.
Yeah. So Jesus criticizes these pretentious displays of faux generosity, right? That cost the giver nothing really, and meanwhile leave the vulnerable destitute. Okay. So he's critical of the practice, but mainly, in fairness, critical of the hypocrisy that he's seen, right? So Jesus doesn't say you don't have to tithe. Jesus says there's all this corruption and all of this sort of hypocrisy around.
Look at yourself.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right. Now we're going to go back to Acts 4, which is what the passage I preached on last week, right? And in Acts 4, the Holy Spirit falls. As many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of all. Right. Nobody is in need. Great. What happens next? They laid it at the apostles' feet. It was distributed to each as any had need. There was a Levite from Cyprus. His name is Joseph. The apostles call him Barnabas. He sold a field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. What do we know about the Levites? They're not supposed to own land, right? Right? So this is actually an act of repentance, right? Barnabas owns land that he's not supposed to own because he's getting income, right, from the tithe, and also here he is on the side, like, my nice plot of olive trees, right? So there's an act of repentance here going on that we're supposed to know our Hebrew Bible well enough to know and say, well, this is right? He's not supposed to have that land to begin with. So he says, oh my gosh, like I gotta live, the way God's going to live. I gotta get rid of this land and give it to the community for those who are in this community. Okay. So Barnabas is kind of our hero in the story, but right, it's calling out a little bit of the hypocrisy of what's going on. Much as Luke, remember this is Luke Acts, right? Same author, talks about Zacchaeus, who has kind of gotten his riches in an unjust way as well. All right, what happens next? Barnabas sells his land. Then there's a man named Ananias, with the consent of his wife Sapphira. They sell a piece of property, and they knowingly keep back some of the proceeds from the sale. Right? And Peter says, "Why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back part of the proceeds of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? After it was sold, were not the proceeds at your disposal? How is it you contrived this deed in your heart? You did not lie to us, but to God." And Ananias hears those words, and he drops dead. And he gets taken out. And then his wife shows up, not knowing what is happening. And Peter says, "Hey, did you sell the house for this and this price?" And she says, "Yes." She lies to him. And he says, "How is it you've agreed together to put the Spirit of the Lord to test? Look, the feet of those who buried your husband are at the door. They'll carry you out." And she falls down at his feet and dies. Okay. It's a
Happy
wild story, right? This is like this.
Peter's going, what?
Yeah, yeah. So to be clear, Peter doesn't kill him. It doesn't
I'm
even
just not
say
gonna
God
touch
strikes.
these
Right.
things.
It doesn't even say God strikes them down, right? But it's sort of like they get the come up. This is
Heart attack about that.
this is a challenge reading the Book of Acts, by the way, is there are sort of these cartoonish villains and heroes, right? And sometimes you think of that in like, imagine me literally trying to apply the logic of this passage here at Modern Christian Church, right? Like if you pledge to me this much money, you actually make this much money, you're gonna die. Right? Like, you would be like, I'm out of here, man. Like,
Don't think it doesn't happen.
forget this, right? Like I'm out, right? But notice what is actually the sin or the violation that's been the lying, right? It's the presenting myself as being, look how generous. I sold my house too, and I gave it. And meanwhile, I'm boarding back here, right? Peter explicitly says, look, why you had the house, you had the house. Right? You didn't have to do that at all. You could have just said, I'm not really there yet. By generosity, right? But by kind of presenting themselves, they're playing the role of those scribes with the long sleeves in the story of the widow, right? They are making themselves into, look how generous I am, while actually kind of hoarding. Right?
And I wonder too about that this is in Acts, it says, now the whole group of those who believed. Okay, so they're basically giving everything because they are now a group.
Yeah.
And they're committing, it's like a commune or something.
Right. Yeah.
Trying to support each other because of their belief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we also see in Acts, well, what Amy will preach on today, right, in the story of Lydia. Lydia welcomes a new church into her house, right? It doesn't ever say Lydia sells her house. What she does is share that house with the community, right? So Acts actually gives us like multiple images of what really extravagant, radical generosity and hospitality look like. And what Ananias and Sapphira get in trouble for is sort of trying to like play act like they're, the most faithful, right? When they're actually kind of, they've got some doubts.
I'll give you all of this money if you put my name in the sanctuary.
Right. Yeah. A lot of times in churches, this doesn't happen in all Christian churches. A lot of times in churches, right, there'll be one or two people who talk a lot about how big of a giver they are. If you actually look at the books, you find that most of the budgets of churches come from small, faithful donations. Give stuff. Right, but sometimes you're like, not generous. Okay. All right. So in Acts 2 and 4, there's sort of this image of the early churches. People give everything, 100%. But, right, there's some discernment and some thinking around, like, well, what does our generosity look like? How do we make sure we're not giving for the wrong reasons, right, which Jesus calls out explicitly? And how is this actually doing what it's supposed to do, which is kind of caring for the people who need it? Notice the logic of Acts 2 and 4 is that people who have land sell it so that no one's in need. It's like everybody becomes a Levite, right? Like everyone now is reliant on the sort of the shared generosity. The priesthood of all believers. We're all reliant on the generosity, where before there was kind of like some people have land and others don't. There's supposed to be kind of a funnel to get resources to the people who don't have resources. Acts 2 and 4 is like everybody. All right. I've got 3 minutes.
I have a story I want to tell before we all go out.
Okay. Let me just So the overall thrust of the New Testament seems clearly in favor of radical acts of generosity inspired by the Holy Spirit on the one hand, and critical of giving in a way meant to make us look good or kind of falsely present ourselves. Right? So the wisdom of understanding possessions is not really mine, but rather stewarding on behalf of God for the common goods. Right? So, do you have to tithe? I don't know. There's, to me, no evidence that the tithe specifically is something that was ever required of Christians until about the 4th century, when some church fathers kind of background. But I think it's actually kind of helpful to think about the tithe because it gives us some wisdom, some principles to think about. One is the principle of the first fruits. The tithe is the first thing you do with your riches, right? So as Christians, I think that's a pretty good wisdom principle for us. We give, right, and then we spend, right? We don't give whatever's left over after we spend. That seems like a pretty good wisdom principle. There's also a principle of proportionality, right? But 10%, if I make more, I give more, right? If something happens and I make less, well, okay, like I've got less resources. So I think there's some wisdom in the idea of like proportional giving, right? I'm on a fixed income. Right? That might change what realistically I can give. If I'm the widow in the story of the widow's mite, right? I might actually need to receive help, right? I might be able to receive it. And I think Jesus is saying, and that's okay, right? That's actually what this whole thing is. So, principles of proportionality. Then there's the principle of promise. As Christians, when we read Hebrew Bible passages that are often interpreted as laws, I think it's always helpful for us to like pray and think and understand what's the promise here? What's the promise that's given? That came up in Malachi, right? God's saying, like, look, I made a promise here. You're going to have enough, but you got to be willing to give out of that enoughness. Otherwise, there's nothing. Okay? So it's like it's not I have to give. I have to give. It's like the promise. You're going to have enough. You can give. Yeah, it's a promise. And 10% is kind of a handy, simple bit of math that I can use. That I can actually look at my budget and say, do I give 10%? If not, why not? Right? What would prevent me from doing it? Is it that my priorities are out of whack? Is it that I don't have enough money to do that? Right? Am I in a massive amount of crushing medical debt? And actually, I need to, I probably need some help getting out from under this stuff, right?
I tell you,
If I give 10%,
in our house, so the question that comes up is, what is that 10% to who?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's lots of things that we feel like is giving.
Yeah.
We're giving things that we want.
Yeah.
To make better.
Right. Yeah.
And the church is definitely going up. It's not hard.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think, for example, like, is my giving to the local food bank somehow less of a gift to God than my gift to the church? I don't actually think so, right? I actually think that those are our part of the same problem.
And I think that there's a lot more giving, and it's represented in our stewardship here, is that it's not just finance, it's time.
Yeah.
I can imagine yesterday the time that people gave for memorial service,
Yeah.
the time that people give, to the church collecting things and going out and buying mattresses and everything that we can do. So to have that be as big a part as the financial giving, I think is important.
Yeah, and much less easier, much less. What am I trying to say? What would giving 10% of my time mean, right? It blurs a little bit that, okay, what is, like, we're tithing meant to do, right? Oh, how many minutes would that be, right? Or how many? That would be missing the point, right? I think is one of the things the gospel message is telling us, right? It's about this. How do we cultivate this kind of generosity spirit, right? So 10% gives me a helpful tool for that, right? Because I can look and I can say, okay, I'm not doing that, or I can look and I can say, I am giving that. And actually, the example of the New Testament is really radical, extreme generous. Actually, I give 10%. So maybe I could actually be more radically generous, right? So is it a law for us? No, I don't think so. But I think it's actually a handy tool, and I think that there's some wisdom to be gained